Kash Patel just reached beneath a Senate witness table, retrieved a plain, unadorned manila folder, and with one heavy acoustic thud against the polished mahogany, systematically dismantled the 40-year political dynasty of Nancy Pelosi on live national television. To truly comprehend the sheer magnitude of the seismic shockwave that just paralyzed this suffocating hearing room, you must first dissect the physical architecture of power meticulously engineered for this exact second. This was never meant to be a routine oversight hearing. It was a heavily orchestrated theatrical execution designed by elite strategists to publicly decapitate the new FBI director's radical agenda. Former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, reigning over her final term in Congress, had been explicitly summoned as the ultimate apex predator to dismantle Patel's sweeping, aggressive reforms. She was positioned high above to publicly annihilate his mandates, the ruthless decentralization of headquarters, staff, the forced redeployment of sheltered agents to the streets, the explosive reopening of crossfire hurricane-related cases, and the chilling active investigation into highly classified documents discovered hidden in burn bags inside a phantom room at FBI headquarters. The physical geometry of the room itself was deliberately weaponized to broadcast this intended slaughter. Pelosi sat perched regally atop the elevated committee dais, a towering historical platform built specifically to project crushing absolute authority downward upon the interrogated. Patel was deliberately relegated to the sunken witness table below, physically boxed into the vulnerable space historically reserved for cornered, sweating suspects. It was an architecture strictly engineered to communicate an unbreakable political hierarchy. Yet, the very second the glaring red lights of the broadcast cameras blinked to life, the grand illusion violently collapsed, revealing a terrifying new reality to millions of viewers. A desperate woman who fundamentally required the physical crutch of a raised platform just to simulate authority, staring down in sudden, creeping dread at a man who emanated absolute lethal command from a simple folding chair. Pelosi's opening statement was an 8-minute masterclass in polished, practiced devastation. She delivered it standing because Nancy Pelosi always stood when she wanted to command a room, adjusting the microphone with the fluid ease of a veteran who had commanded thousands of press conferences. She looked down at Patel with an expression perfected over 4 decades of ruthless political combat, a gaze that communicated without a single word that the person sitting below her was entirely beneath her consideration. Director Patel, she began, her cadence filling the vast room like a finely tuned instrument she had played for 40 years. Let me be direct. You are, by any objective measure, the most unqualified person to hold the office of FBI director in the history of this republic. She paused, letting the word unqualified land heavily in the silent room. She listed his predecessors, emphasizing their traditional pedigrees: Christopher Wray, a former Assistant Attorney General; Robert Mueller, a decorated Marine and federal prosecutor; James Comey, who led the Southern District of New York; Louis Freeh and William Sessions, both federal judges. These were serious men with serious credentials, she stated. Looking at Patel the way a prestigious university president might look at a bewildered student who had wandered into the wrong graduate lecture hall, then came the orchestrated character assassination. She mocked his background, accusing him of writing children's books about a character called King Donald battling villains with a magic wizard, accusing him of promoting QAnon conspiracy theories on podcasts, and signing books with the WWG1WGA hashtag. She accused him of wanting to turn the FBI headquarters into a museum of the deep state, pointing her finger at him from the elevated dais, the signature gesture of a woman who had pointed at hundreds of political opponents and watched every single one of them diminish under the crushing weight of her institutional authority. Her voice began to rise to that practiced theatrical crescendo that had silenced hundreds of chaotic congressional debates. She lauded the career professionals of the FBI, the agents who infiltrated the mafia and dismantled domestic terrorism networks, accusing Patel of destroying their legacy, firing career agents, and relocating headquarters, staffed merely to punish those who did not demonstrate sufficient loyalty to one man. She accused him of reopening closed cases for political revenge, branding him a political content creator with a badge, a conspiracy theorist who got lucky, and a man whom history would remember for turning the world's most powerful law enforcement agency into a weapon of personal vendetta. And history will remember me, she concluded, her voice ringing with self-righteous finality, as the woman who stood in this room and warned America before it was too late. She sat down with the heavy, decisive force of a gavel strike. Spontaneous applause erupted from the Democratic side of the dais, a sustained, deliberate ovation that functioned as much as a political weapon as Pelosi's actual words. 2 Democratic senators nodded with visible, exaggerated approval. Up in the press gallery, a progressive journalist was already typing frantically, posting a tweet that read, "Pelosi just destroyed Patel. This is historic." That post garnered 3,000 retweets before Kash Patel even opened his mouth to respond. Through the entire barrage, Patel had not moved a singular muscle. He wore a dark suit with no tie, his signature subtle rebellion against the expected uniform, the small defiance of a man who now ran the FBI, but fundamentally refused to dress like every polished, bureaucratic director who had come before him. He sat exactly the way seasoned investigators sit in interrogation rooms, leaned slightly forward, elbows resting squarely on the table, dark eyes locked unwaveringly on the subject. It was the dangerous posture of someone who has conducted hundreds of hostile interrogations and knows that the true interrogation begins the exact moment you sit down and hold eye contact. When the applause finally faded and Chairman Grassley nodded toward him, Patel did not pause. He did not reach for his water glass. He simply set his pen down, the quiet click echoing sharply in the sudden silence. "Congresswoman, you covered a lot of ground," Patel began, his voice devoid of anger, stripped of defense, carrying the terrifying calm of an incoming storm. Children's books, QAnon, career agents, history, very thorough. But I notice you didn't mention my actual career. Any of it. So let me fill in the gaps. He did not look down at any notes. He spoke purely from memory, delivering facts in sequential order, the exact way a lethal prosecutor presents irrefutable credentials before a grand jury. I began as a public defender in Miami-Dade County. I represented people the system forgot. Drug addicts, undocumented immigrants, teenagers tried as adults because the system needed a body to close a case. People pulled from overtown street corners who couldn't afford lawyers. I tried cases from drug trafficking to murder. That's where I learned what justice looks like from the bottom, not from the speaker's chair. Patel's voice remained chillingly steady as he dismantled her narrative brick by brick. I became a federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice, hired under the Obama administration, Congresswoman, not Trump, Obama. I prosecuted al-Qaeda and ISIS operatives in cases involving multiple theaters of conflict. I coordinated with 7 intelligence agencies across 3 continents. I handled classified material at the highest levels, material so deeply sensitive that the courtroom had to be cleared and the transcripts permanently sealed. That's not a children's book. That's a federal case file with a body count. He kept his eyes locked on her face. I served as chief investigator for the House Intelligence Committee, where I uncovered the biggest surveillance abuse scandal in FBI history. I wrote the Nunes memo. Everyone called me a conspiracy theorist for it. The media, your caucus, the FBI itself. The agency I now run spied on me for doing it. They used grand jury subpoenas to pull my personal email and phone records without my knowledge. And I was proven right by the Inspector General, by Durham. And by the criminal conviction of the FBI lawyer who falsified evidence. Every conspiracy I theorized turned out to be a fact somebody was hiding. He leaned in just a fraction of an inch closer to the microphone. I served as senior director for counterterrorism on the National Security Council. I coordinated the response to active terrorist threats against the United States. I served as chief of staff to the acting secretary of defense during one of the most volatile transitions in modern military history, and now I run the FBI. Patel paused, letting the sheer, unassailable weight of his resume suffocate the room. So when you call me unqualified, you're describing a public defender, federal terrorism prosecutor, congressional investigator, NSC counterterrorism director, and Defense Department chief of staff. If that's unqualified, I'd love to hear your definition of qualified. It was in that exact breathless moment that Patel reached beneath the table. He pulled out a thick, plain manila folder. It was unadorned, save for a standard issue FBI evidence tag clearly clearly visible on the tab. He set it down on the wooden table. The sound, the flat, heavy, unapologetic thud of thick paper hitting solid wood, was suddenly the loudest, most deafening sound in the cavernous room. On the elevated dais, Pelosi's hand, which had been slowly reaching out for her crystal water glass, froze completely mid-motion. "But we're not here to discuss my resume," Patel said softly, tapping the cover of the folder. "We're here because the FBI has been documenting financial patterns in Congress, and one of those patterns has your name on it. Now I run the FBI, and I've been finding a lot of things people hid. Shall we begin?" The atmosphere in the room violently shifted from a political theater to an active crime scene. Patel opened the folder and began to read, not with the dramatic flair of a politician, but with the flat, precise, clinical detachment of a lead investigator presenting evidence. And that investigative tone was infinitely more devastating than any theatrical delivery could have ever been, because it treated Nancy Pelosi's storied financial history not as a fleeting partisan scandal, but as a severe active criminal case under federal review. Section 1, Subject Financial Profile, Patel read, citing each number and source with devastating accuracy. Subject, Nancy Patricia Pelosi, née D'Alessandro. Entered Congress, 1,987. Congressional salary, $174,000 per year. Current estimated net worth in excess of $200 million. Portfolio growth since entry to Congress, approximately 16,930%. He briefly looked up, fixing his gaze on the dais. For context, the S&P 500 returned approximately 700% over the same period. Warren Buffett averaged roughly 1,200%. Your family outperformed Warren Buffett by a factor of 14. As a former federal prosecutor, when I see returns 14 times better than the best investor alive, my first question isn't how. It's what did they know that nobody else knew? Because that kind of outperformance doesn't come from skill. It comes from inside information. Patel relentlessly turned to the chronological compilation of the file. June 2022. Your husband, Paul, exercises options on 20,000 shares of Nvidia. At this exact time, you, as Speaker, are personally shepherding the CHIPS and Science Act, a $52 billion semiconductor subsidy package, through Congress. July 2022. Media scrutiny suddenly grows. Paul sells the shares at a $341,000 loss. The FBI characterizes this not as ethical compliance, but as evidence awareness. The subject recognized the pattern had been detected. Pelosi's fingers began to drum against the table. It was not the controlled, patient rhythm of a seasoned politician weathering a storm. It was the agitated, highly irregular, nervous pattern of someone hearing their most guarded financial history read aloud in an official FBI case file format for the very first time. Patel didn't let her breathe. July 2024. Paul sells over $500,000 in Visa stock. Weeks later, the DOJ files a massive antitrust lawsuit against Visa. Your family avoided hundreds of thousands in immediate losses through a highly strategic sale timed perfectly before a non-public federal enforcement action. November 2023, Paul purchases Nvidia call options. Within 6 months, he nets approximately $4 million in pure profit. During this specific period, you are actively engaged in AI legislation, heavily affecting Nvidia's market position. Patel set the paper down, looking up. 12 documented instances of high-volume trades correlating perfectly with legislative or regulatory activity across a 4-year sample. In the FBI, 1 coincidence is an anomaly, 2 is a pattern, 12 is a criminal case. Senator Hawley named a bill after you, the Pelosi Act, banning congressional stock trading. They didn't call it the Corruption Act. They named it after you because your name is now synonymous with the practice. Retail investors literally created apps to copy your trades. The Pelosi Tracker, the NANC ETF. Regular working Americans figured out that the most reliable investment strategy in this country is just doing whatever your husband does. Patel leaned back in his chair, his eyes dark and unreadable. When I was a public defender in Miami, my clients were drug dealers and addicts, people at the absolute bottom. When they got caught gaming the system with petty fraud or check kiting, they went to federal prison. You've been operating a $200 million operation on a $174,000 salary for 40 years, and your only punishment has been a bill named after you. In my experience as a prosecutor, the only difference between your operation and the ones I put behind bars is the zip code and the number of zeros. Section 2, Patel continued, his voice cutting through the suffocating tension in the room. Pattern of activity. In FBI investigations, we look for repeated behaviors that strongly suggest deliberate intent rather than accident. Section 2 documents 2 critical events that reveal a distinct pattern of leveraging national security decisions for immense financial and political benefit. Event 1, January 6, 2021. Patel looked up from the file, his expression hardening. Congresswoman, I was Chief of Staff to the Acting Secretary of Defense on January 6th. I was physically in the room at the Pentagon where military support decisions were made. Not in the next room, not on a conference call, in the room. I sat directly across the table from Acting Secretary Miller when the desperate calls came in. I was the one writing the official timeline as it happened. Who called whom, what was requested, what was authorized, what was inexplicably delayed. When I discussed the security posture at the Capitol that day, I'm not reading from a sanitized briefing summary prepared by staff. I am a first-hand participant in the military chain of command. I watched the clock, I took the notes. And I know exactly how long it took for authorization to move through the chain and exactly where the deliberate delays occurred. This was the lethal detail that separated Patel from every other Republican who had ever challenged Pelosi on January 6th. He wasn't citing second-hand reports. He was the primary source. Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund requested National Guard support before January 6th multiple times. Those urgent requests went through the Capitol Police Board, which includes the House Sergeant-at-Arms, who reported directly to your office. On the defense side, we were ready. Secretary Miller had pre-authorized deployment. The authorization required approval through the Capitol Police Board chain. That approval did not come. The FBI deals in evidence, not speculation. What the evidence shows is that security requests were available, authorization was pre-positioned, your chain of command actively did not act on them, and the resulting crisis immediately became the most politically and financially profitable event of your entire career. Second, impeachment under your leadership. A January 6th select committee with members you personally handpicked unprecedentedly rejecting the minority party's nominees to consolidate power. You generated hundreds of millions for Democratic campaigns. A crisis you had the institutional authority to mitigate became the foundation of your most successful political operation. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a timeline. Patel didn't wait for an objection. Event 2, Taiwan, August 2022. Your husband held significant Nvidia positions, call options, giving him leveraged exposure to semiconductor price movements. Nvidia's value is entirely tied to Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company, TSMC. Any disruption to Taiwan's stability threatens Nvidia's supply chain, making domestic semiconductor subsidies a direct, massive financial benefit to your family. You visited Taiwan, becoming the highest-ranking U.S. official to do so in 25 years. The intelligence community briefed you explicitly before the trip. They warned you China would respond with military exercises. They warned you semiconductor supply chain fears would spike globally. You received those classified briefings. You understood the catastrophic market consequences, and you went anyway. China responded with live-fire drills and ballistic missiles over Taiwan. In the immediate aftermath, the CHIPS Act, which had been languishing, suddenly became urgent national security legislation. It passed within days of your return. $52 billion in subsidies. In the FBI, when a subject takes an action they were explicitly warned would cause a specific outcome that benefits them financially, we document it as consciousness of financial motivation. Pelosi furiously leaned into her microphone, her composure cracking. Director Patel, this is precisely the kind of weaponization, Congresswoman Patel said, his voice carrying the terrifying, flat calm of a man who has been interrupted by cartel bosses and terrorists far more dangerous than a former Speaker of the House. When the FBI used grand jury subpoenas to secretly access my personal communications while I was investigating them, nobody let me interrupt. Nobody let me call the investigation weaponization and just walk away. I was investigated. I fully cooperated. I was completely vindicated. That's how the process works. I'd appreciate the exact same standard. The silence that followed was the agonizing sound of an inescapable trap springing shut. If Pelosi argued that investigating her was unacceptable weaponization, she would simultaneously be defending the FBI's past corrupt investigation of Patel as legitimate a contradiction she couldn't afford. The realization washed over her face, the horrific realization of a woman who had spent 40 years being the smartest, most ruthless person in the room, suddenly encountering a problem she could not talk, threaten, or spend her way out of. She slowly sat back in her chair. Section 3, Associated Persons and Network Analysis. Patel read, his pace methodical. The FBI doesn't investigate individuals in isolation. We investigate networks. And your network is one of the most sophisticated I've ever encountered. And I have investigated international terrorist financing operations. July 2024. You orchestrated the brutal removal of a sitting president of the United States from the presidential race. A man you publicly vouched for. Multiple sources confirm your central role. Former First Lady Jill Biden, your friend of 50 years, said publicly, "We were friends for 50 years. It was disappointing." That word from a woman known for measured language carries the crushing weight of a betrayal half a century in the making. You made the calls. You applied the pressure only someone with $137 million in fundraising leverage could apply. Because when the woman who controls the money tells you to step aside, it isn't political advice. It's brutal arithmetic. After Harris lost, you told the New York Times that Biden should have gotten out sooner. Your regret wasn't removing a friend. Your regret was missing the optimal timing. Internal timeline analysis suggests your primary motivation wasn't the presidency at all. It was protecting down-ballot House seats, the seats that determine committee assignments, legislative calendars, and subpoena power, the institutional architecture. Because without control of the legislative calendar, there is no mechanism for timing legislation to benefit the multi-million-dollar trading operation documented in Section 1. Patel outlined her control over 435 House members, the Capitol Police Board, and the media access. When one individual controls legislation, security, fundraising, and personnel, and that same individual's family runs a massive trading operation directly correlating with that legislative activity, the FBI classifies that as a unified control concern. It's the exact organizational structure we typically encounter in organized crime and racketeering investigations. Not because you're a criminal in the traditional street sense, but because the structural execution is functionally identical. Under the table, Pelosi's hand twitched and moved downward out of sight. Patel tracked the movement instantly, an ingrained instinct from 20 years of working hostile interrogation cases where concealed hands meant concealed weapons or hidden intentions. Congresswoman, I notice you're reaching for your phone. In my experience, subjects reach for their phones when they desperately want to call their attorney. If you need counsel, we can recess. But I have two more sections. Her hand shot back up, coming up entirely empty, both hands pressing flat onto the table. The desperate gesture of someone trying to visibly demonstrate transparency while frantically calculating exactly how much they need to conceal. Section 4. Consciousness of guilt, Patel continued, his tone shifting from clinical to deeply personal. The FBI looks for behaviors indicating a subject knows the rules and actively chooses to break them by calculation. September 2020, San Francisco. Every single salon in the city is closed by severe COVID restrictions. Restrictions you publicly championed, voted for, and relentlessly told the American people were absolutely necessary to save lives. Working class small business owners, barbers, nail technicians, people who built their livelihoods with their bare hands, shuttered their shops and went bankrupt because the Speaker of the House told them it was their patriotic duty. Yet security camera footage showed you inside eSalon receiving a full blowout without a mask in a business legally mandated to be locked down. When the footage surfaced, your response was not to apologize. It was not to acknowledge the gross hypocrisy. Your response was to maliciously blame the salon owner. You went on camera and claimed you were set up. The woman who followed your rules, losing income every single day, was the one you ruthlessly accused when you were caught breaking them. That salon owner, Erica Kies, received death threats. She eventually had to close her business and flee San Francisco entirely. The person who followed the rules lost her entire livelihood. The person who broke the rules remained Speaker of the House. In the FBI, we call that consciousness of guilt with extreme blame displacement. I have never seen a cleaner example, other than perhaps the French Laundry Governor Newsom's indoor dining at $350 a plate, while constituents' restaurants were boarded shut. Patel set the behavioral section aside, leaning forward, fully embodying the Miami public defender who intimately remembered what elite rules looked like from the gritty bottom of the social ladder. I want to share something highly personal. When I was a public defender, I represented a man, I'll call him Carlos, who was arrested simply for keeping his humble barbershop open during a shutdown order. Carlos had 3 children. His wife worked at a hotel that had just laid off its entire cleaning staff. The family had exactly one income source left, the barbershop his immigrant father opened in 1979 after fleeing Cuba with $11 and a barber's license. Carlos opened his doors because if he didn't cut hair, he couldn't pay rent. It wasn't a grand political statement. It was sheer survival arithmetic. Code enforcement cited him. The fine was $4,500 more than a month's net income. The judge callously added it to the back rent he already couldn't afford. Carlos eventually lost the shop. The building his father had poured sweat into for 41 years, the same vintage barber chair, the fading photographs of customers from the 1980s all emptied into cardboard boxes in a single devastating afternoon. 41 years of American family legacy wiped out because a man who cut hair couldn't afford a fine for trying to feed his kids. Patel's voice grew dangerously quiet. You opened a salon that was supposed to be strictly closed. Same strict rule, same exact kind of restriction, same city, same state, same pandemic. You didn't get a $4,500 fine. You got a temporary news cycle, and within a week, you were back at the podium dictating to Americans to follow the rules. Carlos lost his father's legacy because he was utterly desperate. You got your hair done because you were completely entitled. He lost his livelihood. You destroyed the salon owner who exposed you. And while Carlos lost his shop, while millions of Americans lost their generational businesses under the draconian restrictions you championed, your husband's financial portfolio included massive, lucrative positions in companies uniquely enhanced by lockdown conditions. Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, CrowdStrike, companies whose stock prices exploded precisely because the restrictions you engineered drove all economic activity online. The American economy lost $3.7 trillion. The barbershop economy, the Carlos economy, was utterly devastated. Yet your family's portfolio miraculously grew by approximately $40 million during that exact same period. Rules for them, astronomical returns for you. For the first time in 40 years of relentless public life, Nancy Pelosi voluntarily turned her face slightly away from the broadcast camera, breaking direct eye contact with the lens. A quarter turn. It was an unprecedented surrender. The camera had always been her greatest instrument, her most trusted ally, the weapon she wielded the way seasoned prosecutors wield forensic evidence. To look away was to definitively surrender the frame. And Nancy Pelosi never surrendered frames. Until this exact second. Patel noticed it instantly. He had spent 20 years in sterile interview rooms watching the involuntary, deeply ingrained body language tells of cornered subjects the microscopic physical leaks that no amount of elite political media training can ever suppress. Congresswoman Patel observed aloud, his voice clinical again. Gaze aversion during direct evidence presentation is a primary discomfort indicator. I've seen it in hundreds of hostile interviews. It universally means the subject internally recognizes the evidence is lethally accurate and cannot be logically contested. He paused, letting the silence hang. It also means we're getting very close. Section 5, the conclusion. Patel did something he had not done the entire hearing. He stood up. The physical shift fundamentally, violently altered the psychological geometry of the room. Seated, he had been physically below Pelosi, looking up at the imposing dais. Standing, he was directly at eye level. The architectural advantage, the committee room, was deliberately designed to provide the manufactured elevation of the elite questioner over the scrutinized questioned, was completely neutralized by a man who simply stood up and refused to bow. He closed the manila folder, gripping it tightly in one hand. Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, 40 years in Congress, a family portfolio that grew 16,930% on a public servant's salary. 12 highly correlated trades. Security decisions on January 6th, followed by unprecedented institutional profit. A Taiwan visit triggering a semiconductor crisis while holding semiconductor options. The brutal removal of a sitting president to preserve your institutional architecture. COVID restrictions you championed, subsequently violated, and massively profited from. These are not rumors. These are heavily documented patterns, financial disclosures, FEC filings, Capitol Police Board records, classified intelligence assessments, and Patel's voice shifted. It grew heavier, darker, dropping an octave, taking on the tone of a lead detective about to describe a gruesome crime scene pathology that simply should not exist in a civilized institution. And FBI case file materials officially recovered from active burn bags hidden inside my own headquarters. A collective gasp, stifled but audible, rippled through the gallery. Speaking of burn bags, let me tell you exactly what I found when I took over the FBI, Patel declared, his eyes burning into Pelosi's. When I became director, I ordered a comprehensive top-to-bottom inventory of all sensitive documents at headquarters. Standard procedure. You want to know what's hidden in the building you now command. During that exhaustive inventory, my tactical team discovered a sensitive compartmented information facility, a SCIF that did not appear on any official architectural floor plan, a ghost room that, according to facilities records, absolutely did not exist. It was hidden in a subterranean subcorridor, omitted from the standard building directory. No official signage, no standard digital access log. A rogue key card reader connected to a shadow system entirely separate from the building's primary security network. My team walked past the heavy steel door twice before a veteran agent noticed the biometric lock was noticeably newer than anything else on that forgotten corridor. Patel leaned closer to the microphone, his words slicing through the frozen air. Inside that phantom room, we found multiple heavy-duty burn bags, the specific kind utilized to permanently destroy highly classified documents. They were sealed with tamper-evident tape, meticulously labeled with dates spanning from 2017 to 2022. Burn bags are strictly supposed to be incinerated on a rigorous schedule, transported securely to the destruction facility, and reduced entirely to ash. That is the unbreakable protocol. These bags had deliberately not been incinerated. They had been hidden. Someone collected them, categorized them, secretly transported them to a room that didn't officially exist, and abandoned them there, as if someone desperately wanted the option of destroying them, but fled before they had the chance, or as if a senior official wanted to keep them hidden as ultimate insurance. Patel raised the folder slightly. Inside those bags were thousands of highly classified documents, materials directly related to Crossfire Hurricane, the corrupt origins of the Russia collusion investigation. Unredacted documents from the classified annex to the Durham report that were illegally withheld from Durham's investigative team. Highly damaging internal communications between senior FBI officials during the 2016 to 2017 period. And, most relevant to today's discussion, glaring financial referral documents detailing congressional corruption that senior bureau officials had received and deliberately never acted upon. I found them, and I have been reading them. Some of what I found relates directly to the broader criminal patterns documented right here in this specific file. I cannot share the granular specifics today. They are currently classified and under active, aggressive review by lethal career prosecutors who have no idea what my personal politics are and, frankly, do not care. But the American people absolutely deserve to know these documents exist. They were deliberately, illegally hidden. And the powerful people who hid them did so because what is inside those bags is utterly devastating to the false, manufactured narrative maintained in this city for the last 8 years. He held the manila folder high for the cameras to capture. Congresswoman, I want to be perfectly clear about what is happening in this room right now. and what is not. I am not announcing immediate criminal charges. The FBI investigates. We relentlessly document. We build ironclad cases. We move when the empirical evidence is complete, not when partisan politics demands it, not when the frantic news cycle demands it, not when political rallies demand it. We act on facts. But what I am formally telling you right now, on the record, is that this specific case file is not closing. It is not being quietly shelved. It is not being buried in a burn bag inside a ghost room that doesn't appear on any floor plan. It is open. And it explicitly stays open until every single question is answered under oath and every single illicit dollar is accounted for. Patel slowly lowered the folder, setting it down on the witness table with finality. You spent 40 years making files magically disappear, Congresswoman. I spent 8 years relentlessly finding them, and now I run the building where the files are kept. He looked directly at her. There was no arrogant smile, no theatrical triumph on his face. Only the cold, terrifying, steady focus of an apex investigator who has officially opened a fatal case and fully intends to close it strictly on his terms. On the dais, Pelosi opened her mouth. The physical mechanics of a word began to form the very first syllable of what should have been a scorching, rehearsed response. It should have been the devastating counterattack she had delivered 1,000 times before, the venomous verbal strike that had routinely ended careers, silenced terrified opponents, and brutally reminded everyone in Washington exactly who held the whip. But her voice caught in her throat. It was not a dramatic, theatrical crack like a scripted movie scene. It was a tremor, a microscopic, involuntary vocal vibration so faint that casual viewers watching on standard television speakers might have completely missed it. But the committee room microphones were highly sensitive, broadcast-grade instruments, and they are notoriously unforgiving. They caught the undeniable tremor of pure fear. They amplified it. And 40 million Americans simultaneously heard the voice of the most powerful, untouchable woman in congressional history genuinely waver for the first time in 4 decades of public dominance. She snapped her mouth shut. She said absolutely nothing. The resulting silence was deafening, far louder than any aggressive rebuttal could have been. It was the frantic, calculating silence of a woman who had computed in the agonizing fraction of a second between opening her mouth and attempting to produce sound that any word she spoke would instantly become the next viral clip, the next damning headline, the ultimate irrefutable evidence that Kash Patel had finally broken something deep inside her that 40 years of vicious political combat had never managed to fracture. "Sleep well, Congresswoman," Patel murmured softly into the microphone. He turned and walked out of the silent room. It was an unhurried, methodical walk, the deliberate exit of a man who knows with absolute certainty that the fatal evidence is securely on the table. The red lights of the broadcast cameras are still recording, and there is absolutely nothing left in the universe to say that the manila folder hasn't already screamed. Crucially, the folder stayed on the table. The final lingering broadcast image was Nancy Pelosi, trapped on her elevated dais, staring blankly down at a plain manila folder she physically couldn't reach and legally couldn't close. The FBI evidence tag glaringly visible on the tab. The network cameras held focus on that specific shot for 8 excruciating seconds. 8 seconds of a solitary folder dominating a room that suddenly felt freezing cold. Those 8 seconds instantly became the most replayed, analyzed, and culturally significant footage of the entire political decade. Within minutes, 2 specific clips went globally viral simultaneously. The first was simply the folder, 7 raw seconds of Patel pulling the manila envelope from the shadows, the heavy thud of paper striking wood, and Pelosi's manicured hand freezing mid-reach. No words were needed. It was the pure, visceral sound of accountability arriving, followed by the paralyzed terror of an elite who had never truly expected to face it. That clip was shared 120 million times in 48 hours. The second viral phenomenon was those final 3 words, "Sleep well," Patel's chilling sign-off, accompanied by the amplified vocal tremor of Pelosi's aborted response, his unhurried exit, and the 8 seconds of the isolated folder. Sleep well. Congresswoman instantly entered the American political lexicon as shorthand for a very specific, terrifying kind of threat. It wasn't the loud, performative warfare of cable news. It was the quiet, methodical, inescapable pressure of a federal investigation that simply will not stop. Within 24 hours, the phrase was emblazoned on thousands of T-shirts, coffee mugs, and bumper stickers. A mainstream country music artist immediately sampled the audio clip into a raw track that rocketed to number 4 on iTunes within a week. At the next 3 massive political rallies, the massive crowds didn't shout the phrase, they murmured it. Tens of thousands of working-class people murmuring sleep well in eerie, synchronized unison. It was the sound of collective, simmering patience, far more unsettling to the Washington establishment than any traditional roar of collective rage. Legal analysts and constitutional scholars furiously debated whether an active FBI director should make such cinematic statements, but they unanimously agreed on one terrifying reality. The statement had been politically and legally devastating. The impenetrable dam had broken. The staggering financial analysis, the 16,930% return, the 12 perfectly correlated trades, the precise Visa sell-off timing violently re-entered the mainstream news cycle with unprecedented, unstoppable force. The critical difference was the psychological framing. Previous media coverage had always framed her wealth as a murky political controversy, a topic for talking heads, debating ethics, or opinion segments, arguing about vague optics. But Patel had officially framed it as an active criminal FBI case file. That psychological shift from political maneuvering to criminal racketeering fundamentally changed how the American public processed the information. It was no longer a polite debate about congressional ethics. It was a hardcore question about federal prosecution. And questions about federal prosecution eventually demand hard answers. The fallout was catastrophic and rapid. The Pelosi Act, the very legislation she had mocked, suddenly passed the Senate with an overwhelming 8-1-19 vote within 2 weeks. The House furiously followed suit within a month. The strict law that Nancy Pelosi had fiercely resisted for years. The law she had arrogantly dismissed as unnecessary. The law she had utilized every arcane procedural tool to violently suppress suddenly became binding federal statute bearing her own name. It was the ultimate crushing irony. Her historical legacy would not be remembered for the sweeping legislation she passed, but exclusively for the brazen corruption she inspired a law to prevent. The walls began closing in instantly. The Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission formally opened aggressive parallel investigations within 10 short days. The Government Accountability Office audit that Senator Rick Scott had previously requested was massively accelerated and expanded in scope. Panicked legal analysts noted that the combined, coordinated apparatus of the FBI, DOJ, SEC, and GAO represented the most comprehensive, suffocating financial scrutiny ever applied to a sitting member of the United States Congress. 4 highly separate federal entities, each wielding independent, unyielding subpoena power, each staffed with aggressive career investigators who would easily outlast any fleeting political cycle. 3 weeks later, at exactly 11:00 p.m. on a Friday night, Nancy Pelosi announced her immediate retirement from Congress. It was the infamous Friday night burial slot, the specific media timing reserved by desperate politicians for news they pray the public is too distracted to read. There were no flashing cameras. There was no grand press conference surrounded by adoring allies. There was no soaring historical final speech on the House floor. It was a sterile written statement. 4 brief paragraphs, 212 words from a woman who had built an entire empire, giving speeches that lasted for hours, who routinely held press conferences running 45 minutes, and who had built an unprecedented career on the fundamental belief that the camera was always her greatest ally. 212 words, and then complete, absolute silence. Within days, public court filings revealed that her family had quietly begun furiously divesting their massive holdings in individual stocks, desperately transitioning the wealth into index funds and blind trusts, the exact ethical arrangement Pelosi had spent years loudly arguing was entirely unnecessary. Further filings reveal they had retained top-tier white-collar criminal defense counsel from Williams and Connolly, the legendary firm that represented Richard Nixon during the darkest days of Watergate. The ominous historical symbolism was certainly not lost on any seasoned legal observer in Washington. For Kash Patel, that explosive hearing cemented an undeniable institutional transformation. The man who had been relentlessly smeared and dismissed as a fringe conspiracy theorist had walked into the lion's den, presented devastating empirical evidence without a hint of hyperbole, stated terrifying conclusions without an ounce of speculation, and formally announced aggressive investigative intentions without promising outcomes he couldn't legally guarantee. Sleep well was never a theatrical boast. It was a blood oath commitment, and in a city built on empty rhetoric, commitments, unlike boasts, always have brutal follow-through. Deep inside the FBI's Washington field office, Special Agent Rebecca Torres sat at her cramped desk and watched the viral replay during her lunch break. She had been with the Bureau for 14 agonizing years, joining just 2 weeks after her 24th birthday, because she deeply believed in the mission, the real mission, the one solemnly carved into the marble of the lobby wall: fidelity, bravery, integrity, not the cowardly mission that elite leadership had slowly mutated it into. The political protection mission, the career survival mission, the sickening mission that explicitly prioritized avoiding congressional anger over actively pursuing congressional corruption. She had watched with profound disgust as the FBI's legendary reputation collapsed internally during the Crossfire Hurricane era. Not from the outside, like the bewildered public, but from the inside, where the institutional rot felt like a personal betrayal. She had watched polished directors promise sweeping reform to Congress while quietly delivering nothing but more suffocating bureaucracy. She had watched brilliant, aggressive agents, people who had built massive RICO cases, dismantled violent drug networks, and disrupted active terrorist cells transfer out to sleepy field offices in Omaha and Salt Lake City, simply because the alternative was staying at headquarters and pretending the core institution hadn't been deeply compromised. She had watched the absolute best investigators she knew resign from the Bureau entirely, handing in their badges because they physically couldn't stomach what the leadership had become. When Patel described his tactical team finding the burn bags inside the ghost skiff, Torres slowly set her black coffee down. She had heard the dark rumors. Every veteran agent in Washington had whispered about it, hushed conversations in the sterile break rooms, oblique references during guarded after-work drinks. It was the kind of dangerous institutional knowledge that lived strictly in echoing hallways and concrete parking garages rather than documented memos and traceable emails. Whispers of explosive files that miraculously disappeared, massive corruption investigations forcefully shut down by unnamed superiors without any logical explanation, and a phantom room that didn't exist on any map but that certain panicked senior officials seemed to desperately know about. He actually found them, she whispered aloud to her partner across the desk, a seasoned 10-year veteran named David Chen. Chen had spent 3 frustrating years on the elite public corruption squad before angrily requesting a transfer because his biggest, most airtight cases kept getting systematically killed at the supervisory level. He actually found them, she repeated, her eyes glued to the screen. Her partner looked at her, his expression tight. You think he'll really follow through? Torres watched the broadcast screen closely. She watched Patel walking out, his back straight, the folder left sitting alone on the mahogany table, radiating danger. She watched the 8 agonizing seconds of silence that felt like the entire country holding its breath. That man was spied on by his own future agency just for investigating their corruption, Torres said quietly, her voice hardening. They illegally pulled his private emails. They tracked his personal phone. They tried to legally bury him with the exact same invasive tools we use on al-Qaeda terrorist suspects. He survived it all. He came back. He took over the entire damn building. And he just found the very documents they desperately tried to burn. She picked up her coffee, a rare, sharp smile touching the corners of her mouth. Yeah, David, he'll follow through. She immediately turned back to her computer terminal, pulling up her active case files. Real case files. The kind that put actual dangerous criminals in federal prisons. The exact kind of work the FBI was historically supposed to be doing before cowardly leadership turned the premier law enforcement bureau into a weaponized political instrument, reducing the sacred mission statement on the marble wall to mere aesthetic decoration. But as she typed, Torres kept one eye firmly locked on the internal digital bulletin board. Because if the new director was actively opening explosive case files on elite congressional corruption, real blood and guts criminal files, not the performative, Toothless investigations that got loudly announced at press conferences only to be quietly shelved. 6 months later, in the dark, there would inevitably be massive internal staffing requests, elite task force assignments, the exact kind of high-stakes, historically significant cases that aggressive career agents spent their lives dreaming about and that compromised senior leadership had spent an entire decade ensuring never saw the light of day. Rebecca Torres fully intended to be the very first agent in line. She had waited 14 long, bitter years for the Federal Bureau of Investigation to finally remember exactly what it was supposed to be. That plain manila folder sitting on a polished Senate witness table strongly suggested that her long wait was finally over. 1,000 miles away in a sweltering little Havana barbershop, 58-year-old Alejandro Vega stood frozen, his eyes glued to a small TV. As Kash Patel's voice echoed through the cramped room, recounting the story of a desperate barber crushed by the state, Alejandro slowly lowered his scissors. In 2020, he had been slapped with a ruinous $4,500 fine simply for keeping his immigrant father's shop open during the lockdowns. It wasn't a political statement. It was sheer survival for his family and his 3 employees. "That's me," Alejandro whispered to Rafael, a loyal customer who had sat in that exact chair for 30 years. The names are different, but the arithmetic is the same. The agonizing contrast burned. Nancy Pelosi had walked into a closed salon for pure vanity and suffered nothing but a fleeting news cycle. Alejandro had opened for survival and spent 7 agonizing months working double shifts while his wife scrubbed hotel floors just to save his father's hard-earned legacy from being completely erased. Watching Pelosi's terrified silence on the screen, Rafael nodded heavily. In Cuba, the powerful didn't follow the rules either. "That's why we fled," the old man murmured, looking at the faded 1980s photographs on the wall. Maybe here, somebody finally has the courage to ask them why. Alejandro took a deep breath and went back to cutting hair. His shop was financially bruised, but still defiantly standing. Meanwhile, in Washington, Patel's manila folder sat heavily on the witness table, a silent threat under the glaring broadcast lights. You have just witnessed history. The man the establishment illegally tried to bury just opened a live criminal file on the most untouchable woman in Congress. If you have waited 8 long years for the elite to finally face the consequences of their own rules, let your voice be heard. Share this story, turn on your notifications, and keep watching. The reckoning has officially begun. The tectonic plates of power are shifting, and Kash Patel's file remains aggressively, undeniably open.